Sometimes the hardest lessons in life come from the smallest teachers. When you've lived long enough to know that real strength isn't found in muscle or money, but in quiet courage that asks for nothing in return. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Miriam Miller worked on Jacob Yoder's Amish farm to feed her 8-year-old daughter, Sarah. When sickness finally knocked Miriam down in the barn one cold morning, little Sarah didn't panic. She picked up her mother's work without a word. Jacob watched this English child tend his goats like she was born to it. Her small hands worked steady and sure. Her smile never wavered, even with tears in her eyes. Jacob had lost his own family years ago and built walls around his heart. But watching Sarah's courage cracked something open inside him. What started as simple kindness would become something neither of them expected. But would the Amish community accept this unlikely family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County. Like a prayer whispered over sacred ground, 5:30 came early in these parts, but Jacob Yoder had been awake for an hour already, sitting at his kitchen table with coffee that had grown cold while he watched the sunrise paint his fields. Gold! At 58, he moved through his days with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to find purpose in routine. His farmhouse stood solid against the Pennsylvania landscape, built by his grandfather's hands in 1887. The wide front porch still bore the marks where his children had once carved their initials into the weathered wood. Now those marks felt more like scars than memories. The house held too much silence these days, too many empty rooms that echoed with ghosts of laughter that would never return. Jacob pulled his black suspenders over his shoulders and reached for his hat. The wide brim had been shaped by decades of weather and work, just like the hands that placed it carefully on his graying head. He caught his reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. When had the lines around his eyes grown so deep? When had his beard become more silver than brown? The wedding ring he once wore now hung on a thin chain around his neck, hidden beneath his plain cotton shirt. He touched it briefly through the fabric, a habit he'd developed over the 7 years since the accident. Sarah. His Sarah. Not the English child, had been picking berries with their twin boys when the drunk driver took the curve too fast on Miller's Creek Road. The impact had been swift. The funerals a blur of black bonnets and hushed condolences. The community had rallied around him, as they always did, but their kindness couldn't fill the hollow places in his chest. Outside, the barn beckoned with familiar comfort. His boots crunched softly on the frost-covered grass as he made his way toward the morning chores. The animals knew his schedule better than any clock. Bessie, his prize Holstein, was already waiting by the gate, her breath steaming in the cool air. She'd been the first calf born after the tragedy, and Jacob had thrown himself into caring for her with an intensity that worried his neighbors. "Good morning, girl," he murmured, running his weathered hand along her flank. "Ready for another day?" The barn was Jacob's sanctuary, filled with the honest smells of hay and leather and the quiet sounds of animals going about their business. He'd built most of it himself, adding stalls and storage as his needs grew. Every board and nail held purpose, just like everything else in his carefully ordered life. It was while he was measuring grain for the horses that he first noticed them. A woman and a small girl walking up his gravel drive, their English clothes, marking them as outsiders, even from a distance. The woman moved slowly, as if each step required careful consideration, while the child bounced alongside her with the boundless energy of youth. Jacob stepped out of the barn to meet them, curious but cautious. Visitors were rare, especially English ones who came on foot before 6 in the morning. "Mr. Yoder?" The woman's voice carried exhaustion like a weight. She was perhaps 30, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that had seen better days. Her jeans were clean but worn thin at the knees, her jacket too light for the October chill. "I'm Miriam Miller. I answered your advertisement in the paper about needing help with farm work." Jacob studied her face, noting the dark circles under green eyes and the pallor that suggested illness or worry, or both. "I didn't expect anyone so early. I'm sorry." We walked from town. "I thought if I could speak with you before you started your day." She wavered slightly, reaching out to steady herself against nothing. The little girl, Sarah, Jacob would learn, immediately moved closer to her mother's side. "Mama's been sick," she said matter-of-factly, her small hand slipping into her mother's. "But she's getting better." Jacob found himself looking into the child's eyes and seeing something there that made his chest tighten. Not pity or fear, but a kind of old wisdom that no 8-year-old should possess. She was a small thing, all elbows and knees beneath a dress that had been carefully mended, with brown hair braided neatly down her back and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "What kind of work experience do you have?" Jacob asked, his practical nature warring with an unexpected urge to invite them inside for coffee. "I grew up on a dairy farm in Ohio before my parents died," Miriam said. "I know how to milk, how to care for livestock, how to mend and clean and cook. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Yoder. I just need a chance." There was something in her voice, not desperation exactly, but the careful dignity of someone who had learned to ask for help without begging. Jacob respected that. He'd grown up understanding that pride was important, but so was survival. "The work starts at 5, he said. 6 days a week. I pay fair wages, but it's physical labor. Milking, cleaning stalls, feeding animals, maintenance. Work around the property." "I can handle it," Miriam said quickly. "We both can. Sarah's been helping me with chores since she was 6. Jacob looked down at the child again. She met his gaze steadily, without the shyness most English children showed around the Amish. "What do you know about goats?" he asked her. Sarah's face brightened. "They're smart and they like to climb things. They'll eat almost anything, but you have to be careful, because some plants make them sick, and they're happiest when they have friends." Despite himself, Jacob felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "That's right. Do you like animals?" "Yes. So Mama says I have a way with them." Miriam's hand tightened protectively on her daughter's shoulder. "Sarah's been around farms her whole life. She's responsible for her age." Jacob nodded slowly. He'd been planning to hire one of the English boys from town, someone strong enough to handle the heavy work. But there was something about this woman and her daughter that stirred feelings he'd thought he'd buried. Maybe it was the way the child looked at his animals with genuine interest instead of fear. Maybe it was the quiet strength in the mother's voice, despite her obvious struggles. "There's a small apartment above the equipment shed," he heard himself saying. "It's not much, but it's clean and warm. If you're interested in the position, you could stay there, make it easier for early mornings." Miriam's eyes widened. "Mr. Yoder, that's very generous, but I couldn't impose." "It's practical," Jacob said gruffly. "Walking from town every day would be difficult, especially in winter." The truth was more complicated. Something about watching Sarah's protective stance beside her clearly unwell mother reminded him of his own boys, the way they'd stood together against the world's uncertainties. The memory was painful but also warming, like touching a healing wound. "Could we see it?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with cautious hope. "The apartment?" Jacob found himself nodding. "Come along then." The equipment shed sat about 50 yards from the main house, its second story converted years ago into a simple living space. Jacob had built it when his eldest son had talked about staying on the farm after marriage. The apartment was small but complete, a sitting area, tiny kitchen, bedroom and bathroom, with everything needed for simple living. Miriam ran her hand along the wooden countertop, noting the careful craftsmanship. "You built this yourself?" "My father taught me carpentry," Jacob said. "Nothing fancy, but it's solid." Sarah had found the window that looked out over the pasture where Jacob's goats spent their days. "Look, Mama, you can see all the animals from here." "It's perfect," Miriam said softly. "But Mr. Yoder, we should discuss terms. I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Jacob interrupted. "It's practical. I need reliable help and you need work and a place to live. The arrangement benefits us both." He named a wage that was fair but not generous, along with the apartment. As part of the compensation, Miriam considered for a moment, then extended her hand. "When would you like us to start?" "Tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock sharp." As he watched them walk back toward town to collect their belongings, Jacob felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in 7 years, his farm would house voices other than his own. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. That evening, he found himself cleaning the apartment more thoroughly than necessary and checking that everything worked properly. He told himself it was simple consideration for his new employees, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about Sarah's old eyes and a young face and Miriam's determined grace had reached through his carefully constructed defenses. As the sun set over his fields, Jacob touched the ring beneath his shirt and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in years, not for forgiveness or understanding, but for the strength to open his heart just enough to let in the light these two strangers might bring to his carefully ordered darkness. He had no idea how much his world was about to change. 3 weeks later, Jacob had settled into a rhythm he hadn't expected to enjoy. Miriam arrived each morning precisely at 5, moving through the barn with quiet efficiency, while Sarah helped with smaller tasks. The child had a natural way with the animals that reminded Jacob of his own boys at that age. Fearless but respectful, intuitive about what each creature needed. This particular morning carried the sharp bite of late October. Jacob was repairing a loose board on the chicken coop when he heard Sarah's voice from the barn, higher pitched than usual. "Mama? Mama? What's wrong?" The note of panic in those words sent Jacob dropping his hammer and running toward the barn. He found Sarah kneeling beside her mother, who had collapsed between the milking stalls. Miriam was conscious, but pale as winter sky, her breathing shallow and labored. "I'm fine," Miriam whispered, trying to sit up. "Just dizzy for a moment." But her words were cut short as another wave of weakness overcame her. She slumped back against the wooden post, her face beaded with perspiration despite the cold morning air. "How long has she been like this?" Jacob asked Sarah, his voice gentle but urgent. "She's been tired for weeks," Sarah said, her small hands hovering over her mother as if she could somehow hold her together through touch alone. "She tries to hide it, but I see her when she thinks I'm sleeping. Sometimes she can't eat breakfast because her stomach hurts." Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd noticed Miriam moving more slowly lately, taking longer breaks, but he'd attributed it to the physical demands of farm work. Now, seeing her grey complexion and the way she struggled just to keep her eyes open, he realized something was seriously wrong. "Sarah, run to the house and call Dr. Henderson," he said, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. "Tell him Jacob. Yoder needs him at the farm right away." "No," Miriam managed, grabbing weakly at Jacob's arm. "No doctors. We can't afford—" "That's not your concern right now," Jacob said firmly. He lifted Miriam as easily as he would a child, noting how light she felt in his arms. "Sarah, make that call." But Sarah stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror. "Is Mama going to die?" The question hit Jacob like a physical blow. In Sarah's voice, he heard an echo of his own children asking similar questions the night of the accident. Questions he'd been too devastated to answer properly then. "No," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Your Mama's going to be fine, but she needs help, and that means seeing a doctor." By the time Dr. Henderson arrived, Jacob had gotten Miriam settled in the apartment, and Sarah had managed to coax some water between her mother's lips. The elderly physician, who had been caring for both English and Amish families in the area for 40 years, took one look at Miriam and frowned deeply. "How long have you been feeling unwell, dear?" "It's nothing serious," Miriam said weakly. "Just tired from working hard. Mama throws up almost every morning," Sarah interrupted, earning a sharp look from her mother. "And she hasn't been eating much for 2 weeks." Dr. Henderson's examination was thorough but gentle. He checked Miriam's blood pressure, listened to her heart and lungs, pressed carefully along her abdomen. Jacob watched from across the room, holding Sarah's hand as the child trembled with worry. "Mrs. Miller, I'm going to need you to come to my office for some blood work," Dr. Henderson said finally. "There are several possibilities we need to rule out, including some that require immediate attention. I can't afford—" Miriam began. "We'll figure out the payment later," the doctor said kindly. "Right now, I'm more concerned about your health than your finances." After Dr. Henderson left with promises to call as soon as the test results came back, Jacob found himself in an unfamiliar position. He had 2 people depending on him who weren't his responsibility, yet somehow felt like they were becoming exactly that. Sarah sat beside her mother's bed, holding Miriam's hand and stroking her hair with the careful tenderness of someone who had done this many times before. The sight stirred memories Jacob had tried to keep buried. His own Sarah comforting the boys when they had nightmares, the gentle way she'd cared for sick animals on the farm. "Mr. Yoder," Sarah said quietly, not looking up from her mother's face. "What if the doctor finds something really bad?" Jacob sat down in the chair beside the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups get sick and need medicine to feel better. That's what doctors are for. But what if the medicine doesn't work?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jacob looked at this brave little girl who was trying so hard to be strong for her mother and felt something crack, open in his chest that he'd thought was permanently sealed. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said. "But right now, your job is to take care of yourself and help your mama rest. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "I've been taking care of things for a long time." The simple statement broke Jacob's heart. No child should have to carry such burdens, yet here was Sarah accepting responsibility with the grace of someone twice her age. That afternoon, while Miriam slept fitfully, Jacob watched Sarah move through the barn, completing her mother's tasks without being asked. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, and even attempted to milk Bessie, though her small hands made the process slow and difficult. "Here," Jacob said gently, kneeling beside her. "Let me show you a different way." Together, they worked through the evening chores, Sarah asking thoughtful questions about each animal's needs and habits. Jacob found himself talking more than he had in months, explaining the rhythms of farm life to someone who listened with genuine interest. "My daddy left when I was 5, Sarah said suddenly as they carried feed to the goats. "Mama said he wasn't ready to be a father, but you're different." Jacob's hands stilled on the bucket handle. "Different how?" "You care about taking care of things, even when it's hard." The observation was so quietly profound that Jacob felt tears prick his eyes. When had he last been seen so clearly by anyone, let alone a child? That evening, Dr. Henderson called with news that confirmed Jacob's worst fears. Miriam's blood work showed severe anemia and other markers that suggested a serious underlying condition requiring immediate specialist care. "She needs to see an oncologist as soon as possible," Dr. Henderson said quietly. "I've made an appointment for Thursday morning." Jacob hung up the phone and looked through the window toward the apartment where Sarah sat reading to her sleeping mother. The child had no idea how drastically her world might be about to change, and Jacob felt the weight of that knowledge settle on his shoulders like a heavy yoke. He touched the ring beneath his shirt and made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Whatever came next, Sarah and Miriam wouldn't face it alone. Somehow, without his permission, they had become his responsibility. More than that, they had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The scared little boy inside him whispered warnings about opening his heart to loss again, but Jacob pushed those fears aside. Some things were worth the risk, and watching Sarah's quiet courage had reminded him what those things were. As darkness settled over the farm, Jacob began making plans. If Miriam was seriously ill, Sarah would need stability and care. If the worst happened, a possibility he refused to fully consider, the child would need a home and a future. Looking out at his empty fields, Jacob realized that his carefully ordered life was about to be turned completely upside down. For the first time in 7 years, he found himself looking forward to the chaos. The oncology appointment brought news that fell somewhere between Jacob's hopes and fears. Miriam had a treatable condition, but recovery would require months of medication, rest, and careful monitoring. The medical bills would be substantial, far beyond what her farm work wages could cover. "I can't ask you to keep us on," Miriam said that evening, sitting at Jacob's kitchen table with hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. "Not when I can't do the work I was hired for." Jacob studied her face in the lamplight. The medication had already begun to restore some color to her cheeks, but she still looked fragile, like a bird with a healing wing. Sarah sat beside her mother, working on homework with the focused intensity that had become familiar to Jacob over the past weeks. "Where would you go?" he asked simply. Miriam's silence was answer enough. She had no family, no savings, no backup, planned beyond the faith that somehow things would work out. It was the kind of faith that Jacob had once shared, before life taught him that sometimes faith wasn't enough. "The guest room in the main house is larger than the apartment," Jacob said, his voice carefully neutral. "More comfortable for someone recovering from illness." "Mr. Yoder, I couldn't—" "It's practical," he interrupted, using the same phrase that had convinced her to accept the apartment. "You need rest and proper care. Sarah needs stability, and I—" He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "I could use the company." Sarah looked up from her arithmetic worksheet. "Could I still help with the animals?" "Every morning," Jacob promised. "In fact, I was thinking you might like to learn how to carve wood. I have some tools in the workshop that belonged to my father." The child's face lit up with the first genuine smile Jacob had seen from her since her mother's collapse. "Really? Could I make something useful?" "Everything should be useful," Jacob said, echoing words his own father had spoken decades ago. "Beauty without purpose is just vanity." That weekend, Jacob helped them move their few belongings into the main house. Watching Sarah arrange her small collection of books on the shelf in what had once been his youngest son's room stirred emotions Jacob wasn't prepared for. The space had been empty for so long that he'd forgotten how a child's presence could transform 4 walls into something alive. Miriam insisted on contributing however she could, taking over meal preparation and light housework, despite Jacob's protests. Her cooking was simple but flavorful, and Jacob found himself lingering at the dinner table longer than he had in years, drawn into conversations that ranged from Sarah's observations about the animals to Miriam's memories of her childhood on her parents' farm. "Why didn't you ever remarry?" Miriam asked one evening while Sarah played with the barn cats on the front porch. The question was gentle but direct, spoken with the frankness of someone who understood grief. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching his coffee grow cold. "I tried. Early on. The community encouraged it, said it wasn't good for a man to be alone." He smiled ruefully. "But my heart wasn't ready to let anyone else in. Eventually I stopped trying." "And now?" The question hung between them like morning mist, full of possibility and uncertainty. Jacob looked out at Sarah, who was teaching one of the kittens to chase a piece of string, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Now I'm learning that sometimes life gives you second chances when you least expect them. It was during Sarah's second week in the main house that Jacob began carving her first project, a small wooden goat that would fit perfectly in her pocket. He worked on it in the evenings after chores, sitting in his workshop by lamplight while the sound of Miriam's gentle voice drifted from the house as she read bedtime stories. The goat was simple, but carefully crafted, with details that spoke of patience and affection. Jacob carved each leg with deliberate precision, shaped the ears with gentle curves, and smoothed the whole piece until it felt warm and alive in his hands. When he presented it to Sarah the following morning, her reaction was everything he'd hoped for and more. "You made this for me?" she whispered, turning the carved goat over in her small palms. "It looks just like Gertie." Gertie was Sarah's favorite among Jacob's goats, a gentle brown doe who had taken to following the child around the pasture like a faithful dog. Sarah had named her within the first week, despite Jacob's protests that naming farm animals was impractical. "Every good farmer needs something to remind them why they do the work," Jacob said, his voice gruff with emotion. "That's yours." Sarah threw her arms around Jacob's waist with a fierce hug that caught him completely off guard. "Thank you," she said against his shirt. "I'll keep it forever." The simple gesture, a child's spontaneous affection, nearly undid Jacob completely. When had he last been hugged with such pure gratitude? When had such a small gift brought such obvious joy? That afternoon, as Jacob watched Sarah show the carved goat to every animal in the barn, he felt the last of his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. This child, with her old soul and brave heart, was healing parts of him he'd thought were permanently broken. But even as warmth began to return to his life, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that their newfound peace was temporary. The Amish community had noticed the changes at his farm, the English woman and child living in his house, the way he smiled more readily, the extra care he took with his appearance each morning. Bishop Stoltzfus had already made 2 visits, ostensibly, to check on Jacob's spiritual well-being, but clearly curious about his unusual living arrangements. The questions were polite but pointed. How long would Mrs. Miller be staying? What were Jacob's intentions? Was he considering the impact on his standing in the community? Jacob had answered carefully, emphasizing Miriam's illness and Sarah's need for stability, but he could see the concern in the bishop's eyes. The Amish way valued community above individual desire, tradition above innovation. Taking in English strangers was viewed with suspicion, even when motivated by Christian charity. As October faded into November, Jacob found himself caught between 2 worlds, the growing warmth of his makeshift family and the cooling disapproval of his community. Sarah's laughter in his kitchen and Miriam's quiet presence at his table had awakened feelings he'd thought buried forever. But the weight of generations of tradition pressed against his heart like a stone. Change, Jacob was learning, came with a price he wasn't sure he was prepared to pay. But watching Sarah fall asleep each night clutching her wooden goat, he knew there was no turning back from the path they'd started down together. Some bridges, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. November brought the first real snow of the season, and with it a kind of cocoon-like intimacy to the farmhouse that Jacob hadn't experienced in years. The early darkness meant longer evenings by the fire, with Sarah working on her lessons at the kitchen table while Miriam mended clothes with careful, precise stitches. Jacob had discovered that Miriam possessed a remarkable talent with needle and thread. She'd quietly begun repairing tears in his work shirts, darning holes in his socks, and patching worn spots in his trousers, with an attention to detail that spoke of years of making things last out of necessity. "You don't need to do that," he'd protested the first time he found her working on his clothes. "I need to contribute somehow." Miriam had replied, not looking up from the tear she was mending. Besides, these shirts have years of wear left in them with proper care. Her sewing kit had become a fixture on the kitchen counter, a worn leather pouch that held needles, thread, buttons, and small scissors that had belonged to her mother. Jacob often caught her touching the kit absently when she thought no one was watching, as if drawing comfort from the connection to her past. The medication was working. Colour had returned to Miriam's face, and she moved with more energy than she'd shown since her collapse. But Jacob noticed she still tired easily, still needed afternoon rests that she tried to hide from Sarah. Recovery, Dr. Henderson had warned, would be measured in months, not weeks. "Tell me about your family," Miriam said one evening as they sat by the fire after Sarah had gone to bed. Snow tapped gently against the windows, and the old house creaked with familiar settling sounds. Jacob was quiet for so long that Miriam began to apologize for prying, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I had 2 sons," he said finally. "Daniel and David, twins. They were 6 when—" he paused, his throat working. "My wife Sarah was taking them berry-picking along Miller's Creek Road. A drunk driver came around the curve too fast." Miriam's hand found his across the space between their chairs. Her fingers were warm and calloused from work, real in a way that anchored him to the present. "They would have been 13 now," Jacob continued. "Daniel wanted to be a carpenter, like me. David loved the animals more than anything. He would have taken over the farm eventually. And your wife? She was everything good in my life," Jacob said simply. "Patient, kind, funny, in ways that surprised me every day. She made this house feel alive." He looked around the room that had been so empty for so long. "I thought it never would again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still joined, watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Finally, Miriam spoke. "Sarah's father left when the medical bills from her birth got too high. He said he wasn't ready for the responsibility." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Jacob heard the old pain beneath the words. "I thought I was protecting her by not pursuing him for support, but maybe I was just protecting myself from more rejection. Where is he now?" "I don't know. Last I heard he was in California, starting fresh with someone new." Miriam smiled ruefully. "Someone without complications or medical expenses, or a child who asks too many questions." Jacob thought about Marcus Miller, a man who could walk away from Sarah's bright spirit and fierce loyalty, and felt anger kindle in his chest. What kind of man abandoned his own child? What kind of father chose convenience over love? "His loss," Jacob said quietly, and meant it. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Ruth Byler arrived with her sister Emma, both carrying covered dishes and expressions of neighborly concern that didn't quite mask their curiosity. "We thought you might appreciate some help with meals," Ruth said, setting a pot of soup on the counter while her eyes took in every detail of the kitchen. Miriam's sewing kit, Sarah's schoolbooks, the general sense of female presence that had transformed Jacob's bachelor household. Ruth was 43, widowed young when her husband died in a farming accident, and she'd been managing her own farm with quiet competence for 8 years. She was attractive in the understated way of Amish women, with kind eyes and capable hands, and Jacob knew she'd been considered a suitable match for him by several community members. "This is very thoughtful," Miriam said, emerging from the sitting room where she'd been helping Sarah with arithmetic. "I'm Miriam Miller." The introduction was polite but awkward. Ruth's eyes lingered on Miriam's English clothes, her uncovered hair, the easy familiarity with which she moved through Jacob's kitchen. "Mrs. Miller has been recovering from illness," Jacob explained, his voice carefully neutral. "She and her daughter are staying here temporarily." "Of course," Ruth said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Christian charity is always important." The visit lasted exactly long enough to be polite, with Ruth asking gentle questions about Miriam's health and background, while Emma entertained Sarah with stories about her own grandchildren. But Jacob felt the undercurrent of assessment, the way both women catalogued every detail to share with others later. After they left, Miriam was unusually quiet. "They seem nice," she said finally, scrubbing dishes with unnecessary vigor. "Ruth is a good woman," Jacob agreed. "She's had her own struggles. She's interested in you." The statement hung in the air between them. Jacob couldn't deny it. Ruth had made her availability clear in small ways over the past few years, and several community members had hinted that a marriage between them would be practical and appropriate. "Perhaps," he admitted. "She'd be a suitable choice," Miriam continued, still not looking at him. "Part of your community, someone who understands your way of life." Jacob studied Miriam's profile as she worked, noting the tension in her shoulders, the careful neutrality of her voice. "Is that what you think I should do?" Finally, she turned to face him, her green eyes bright with emotions she wasn't quite ready to name. "I think you should do whatever makes you happy. You've already sacrificed enough for duty and expectation." That afternoon, Jacob found Sarah in the barn, sitting in Gertie's stall with her wooden goat clutched tightly in her hands. Tears had left tracks down her cheeks. "What's wrong, little one? Are we going to have to leave?" she asked in a small voice. "Because of those ladies." Jacob knelt beside her in the straw, his heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. "What makes you ask that? I heard Mama crying in her room after they left. She does that sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep, when she's worried about things we can't control." The simple observation reminded Jacob again of how much this child had been forced to understand about adult fears and uncertainties. No 8-year-old should have to worry about displacement and instability. "You're not going anywhere," Jacob said firmly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. Promise?" Promise. But even as he spoke the words, Jacob wondered if he'd have the strength to keep them when the community pressure intensified. Because it would intensify. He could see it in Ruth's careful assessment, in Bishop Stoltzfus's pointed questions, in the way conversations stopped when he entered Miller's store. Change came slowly in Amish country, and Jacob was pushing against centuries of tradition. The question was whether love could triumph over convention, whether the family they were building could survive the forces that sought to pull it apart. Looking into Sarah's trusting eyes, Jacob made a silent vow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, this child would never again have to worry about being abandoned by the people she counted on. Some promises were worth everything it cost to keep them. December brought the first major test of their unconventional arrangement when Bishop Stoltzfus arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, accompanied by 2 church elders Jacob had known since childhood. The timing seemed deliberate, just as Jacob was teaching Sarah to harness the draft horses, showing her how to check the leather for wear and adjust the fit properly. "Jacob!" the bishop called from the barn entrance, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had guided their community for 20 years. "We need to speak with you." Sarah looked up from the harness she was examining, her small hands still, holding the heavy leather straps. Jacob could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the same wariness she'd shown when social workers had visited their previous apartment, asking questions about her mother's ability to provide proper care. "Sarah, why don't you go help your mother with lunch preparations?" Jacob suggested gently. "We'll finish this lesson later." The child nodded and carefully hung the harness back on its peg, but Jacob noticed how she lingered near the barn door, clearly reluctant to leave him alone with the stern-faced men. "Come inside, gentlemen," Jacob said once Sarah was out of earshot. "The cold is bitter today." They settled in his sitting room, the elders taking the chairs, while Bishop Stoltzfus remained standing, his black hat held carefully in weathered hands. The room felt smaller with their presence, heavy with unspoken judgment. "Jacob, we're concerned about your living situation," the bishop began without preamble. "The English woman and her child, it's been 2 months now. The community is asking. In questions." "What kind of questions?" Jacob kept his voice level, though he could feel his defenses rising. Elder Mast, a man Jacob's father's age with a beard white as fresh snow, leaned forward in his chair. "Questions about propriety, about your commitment to our ways, about what kind of example you're setting for the younger members." "I'm providing Christian charity to a woman recovering from serious illness and her child," Jacob said. "I thought that was consistent with our faith." "Charity, yes," Bishop Stoltzfus agreed, "but there are proper ways to help the English. Through the church, through organized relief efforts. Not by taking them into your home as if they were family." The word family hung in the air like an accusation. Jacob felt something protective and fierce rise in his chest, the same instinct that had driven him to shield his own children from criticism or harm. Mrs. Miller needed immediate help. Her daughter needed stability. There wasn't time for committee meetings and proper procedures. Elder Byler, Ruth's father, spoke for the first time. 2 months ago, perhaps. But now? The woman appears recovered. The child could be placed with English foster families who understand their ways. The casual dismissal of Sarah's well-being hit Jacob like a physical blow. These men, who had known him since he was Sarah's age, were suggesting he abandon a child who had come to trust him completely. "Sarah is not a problem to be solved," Jacob said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "She's a little girl who has already faced too much uncertainty in her short life." "She's not your responsibility," Elder Mast pointed out. "You have no legal claim to her, no blood relationship. Your primary duty is to this community, to preserving our traditions." Bishop Stoltzfus sat down finally, his expression softening slightly. "Jacob, no one questions your good heart. We remember how you suffered after the accident, but grief can sometimes cloud our judgment, make us reach for things that aren't meant for us." The implications stung because it contained just enough truth to hurt. Jacob couldn't deny that Sarah and Miriam had filled empty places in his life, that their presence had awakened feelings he'd thought buried with his first family. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Help them find appropriate English housing," the bishop said. "Perhaps contribute to their expenses if you feel called. To continue supporting them, but return your household to proper order." Through the window, Jacob could see Sarah in the yard, throwing corn to the chickens, while Miriam hung laundry on the line. The domestic scene looked so natural, so right, that the idea of dismantling it felt like sacrilege. "And if I refuse?" 3 men exchanged glances. Elder Byler cleared his throat. "The community's patience isn't unlimited, Jacob. There are consequences for those who consistently place personal desires above our collective good." Shunning. They didn't say the word, but it hovered in the room like smoke from a dying fire. To be cut off from the only community he'd ever known, to lose the support system that had sustained his family for generations, it was a prospect that should have terrified him. Instead, Jacob felt something like relief. The threat clarified his choices in a way that months of subtle pressure hadn't managed. "I need time to consider your words," he said finally. "Of course," Bishop Stoltzfus agreed, rising from his chair. "But don't take too long, Jacob. Some decisions become more difficult the longer we delay them." After they left, Jacob sat alone in the quiet sitting room, staring at the space where the men had delivered their ultimatum. Through the kitchen, a doorway, he could hear Miriam humming softly as she prepared lunch, the sound mixing with Sarah's chatter about the chickens' personalities and quirks. It was then that Hannah Yoder arrived, her arms full of what appeared to be half the contents of her kitchen. Hannah was the bishop's wife, but she was also Jacob's cousin, and had been like an older sister to him after his parents died. "I brought soup and fresh bread," she announced, bustling into the kitchen where Miriam was slicing vegetables. "And some of that honey cake Sarah liked when she visited last week." Jacob watched from the doorway as Hannah set out food with efficient movements, chatting easily with Miriam about recipes and winter preparations. There was no judgment in her manner, no careful assessment, just the natural kindness that had made her beloved in the community for 30 years. "How did the meeting go?" Hannah asked quietly when she found Jacob lingering in the hall. "About as expected." Hannah nodded, her expression sympathetic but not surprised. "My husband is a good man, Jacob, but he sees the world in black and white. Sometimes life requires more nuance than our rules provide for. The community includes people like me," Hannah interrupted gently, "people who remember what you went through 7 years ago, who see how much lighter you are now. Not everyone agrees with the elder's position." It was the first hint Jacob had received that he might not be as isolated as he'd feared. But enough do. Perhaps. But sometimes the right choice isn't the popular one. That afternoon, Sarah started at the local one-room schoolhouse, carried there by Jacob in his buggy through the early December snow. Teacher Mary Stoltzfus, the bishop's youngest daughter, was a gentle woman in her 20s who welcomed Sarah with genuine warmth. "We have children from several English families who attend when they're living in the area temporarily," she explained to Jacob. "Sarah will fit right in." Watching Sarah take her seat among the dozen students ranging from 6 to 14, Jacob felt a complex mix of pride and worry. The child adapted with the resilience that had become her trademark, but he could see her taking careful measure of her new environment, calculating what was expected and how to meet those expectations. After school, Sarah bounded into the buggy, with stories about her classmates and the lessons she'd learned, but as they drove home through the gathering dusk, she grew quiet. "The other children asked me lots of questions," she said finally. "What kind of questions?" "About why we live with you. About whether Mama is going to marry you. About whether I'm going to become Amish." Jacob felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you're taking care of us because that's what good people do," Sarah said simply, "and that I don't know about the other things, but I hope we can stay forever." The innocent honesty of her response nearly broke Jacob's heart. Here was a child who had never known stability, who had learned not to count on permanence, expressing the deepest wish of her young heart with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who expected disappointment. That night, after Sarah was asleep and Miriam was resting, Jacob sat in his workshop with the community cookbook that several Amish women had given to Miriam the week before. It was a gesture of acceptance, of inclusion in the network of mutual support that sustained their community through difficult times. The cookbook's pages were filled with handwritten recipes, tips for preserving food, remedies for common ailments, the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had made homes and raised children in harmony with the land and each other. Someone had included Miriam in that circle of knowledge, had decided she belonged among them despite her English background. The gift represented a kind of acceptance that transcended the formal positions taken by church leadership. Looking at the careful handwriting and personal notes scattered throughout the book, Jacob realized that his community was more complex than the stark choices presented by the elders. There were people who saw past differences to the human needs that connected them all. The question was whether their quiet support would be enough to sustain the family he was building, or whether the weight of tradition would ultimately force him to choose between love and belonging. As snow continued to fall outside his workshop windows, Jacob touched the ring beneath his shirt and whispered a prayer for wisdom. Some decisions would define the rest of his life, and he was running out of time to make them. The week between Christmas and New Year brought an unexpected gift to Jacob's workshop: his father's woodworking tools, retrieved from the storage shed where they had gathered dust for 15 years. The chest was heavy oak, built by his grandfather's hands, and inside lay instruments that had shaped 3 generations of Yoder craftsmanship. Sarah knelt beside the open chest with reverent curiosity, her small fingers tracing the worn handles of chisels and planes that had created furniture, toys, and practical items for countless families over the decades. "Your grandfather made this workbench," Jacob told her, running his hand along the scarred but solid surface. "And his father built the chest that holds these tools. Every piece has a story." "Will you teach me their stories?" Sarah asked, lifting a small carving knife and testing its balance in her palm. "That knife belonged to my great-grandfather," Jacob said, kneeling beside her. "He used it to carve the wooden buttons on your winter coat." Sarah looked down at her coat hanging on its peg, seeing the simple wooden buttons with new understanding. "He made those? For me?" "Not for you, specifically," Jacob clarified gently. "But for someone like you. Someone who would need warm clothes and careful craftsmanship to get through hard winters." The concept seemed to captivate Sarah completely. The idea that she was connected to people she'd never met, through objects that had passed from hand to hand across generations. Jacob watched her examine each tool with growing wonder, asking questions about their purposes and the men who had wielded them. Teaching Sarah woodworking became Jacob's new evening routine. After dinner, while Miriam caught up on mending or correspondence, he and Sarah would retreat to the workshop where patient hands guided smaller ones through the fundamentals of measuring, cutting, and shaping. "The wood wants to become something useful," Jacob explained as Sarah struggled with her first project, a simple birdhouse that would provide shelter for wrens in the coming spring. "Our job is to help it find its proper form." Sarah's concentration was absolute as she worked, her tongue poking out slightly as she focused on keeping her cuts straight and her measurements precise. The birdhouse progressed slowly, with frequent corrections and gentle guidance, but Jacob found himself in no hurry to finish. These quiet hours in the workshop, sharing skills that connected him to his ancestors, felt like a sacred trust being passed to worthy hands. It was during one of these evening sessions that Miriam joined them, settling on a stool near the workbench. With her sewing basket, the 3 of them worked in comfortable silence, each focused on their craft while drawing comfort from the other's presence. "I never had this growing up," Miriam said suddenly, her voice soft in the lamplight. A father figured to teach practical skills, to show patience with mistakes. Jacob looked up from the board he was smoothing. "What about your father?" "He died when I was 12. Before that, he was always working, always stressed about money and crops and keeping the farm afloat. There wasn't time for leisurely lessons or gentle teaching." She paused in her stitching, her eyes distant with memory. "I used to watch other fathers with their children and wonder what it would feel like to have someone care enough to share their knowledge so generously." The observation hit Jacob in ways he wasn't prepared for. He'd been thinking of these woodworking sessions as a gift to Sarah, a way of sharing his heritage and skills. It hadn't occurred to him that Miriam might be experiencing something healing in watching her daughter receive the patient attention she herself had never known. "Sarah's fortunate to have you," Miriam continued, meeting Jacob's eyes across the workshop. "Not just for the practical skills, but for the way you teach them, with kindness instead of impatience, encouragement instead of criticism." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. She's a good student, eager to learn. She's also had teachers before who made her feel stupid for asking questions, Miriam said quietly. You make her feel capable and valued. That's a rare gift. As January deepened and Sarah's birdhouse neared completion, Jacob began to understand what Miriam meant. The child approached each new challenge with growing confidence, no longer apologizing for mistakes or hesitating to ask for clarification. She was learning to trust her own abilities and to see setbacks as part of the learning process rather than evidence of failure. But the peaceful rhythm of their evenings was disrupted by growing tension in the broader community. Bishop Stoltzfus had made his expectations clear in subtle but unmistakable ways. Pointed sermons about the dangers of worldly influences, casual mentions of families who had strayed from proper paths and found themselves isolated from fellowship. The pressure was taking its toll on Jacob standing among his neighbors. Orders for his carpentry work had slowed noticeably, and conversations at Miller's store grew stilted when he entered. Even longtime friends seemed uncertain how to navigate the changing dynamics. Ruth Byler's visits had become more frequent and pointed. She arrived with offerings of food and assistance, staying longer each time to help with household tasks, while making gentle inquiries about Jacob's long-term plans. "Winter's been hard on everyone," she observed one afternoon while helping Miriam with laundry. "But spring always brings new possibilities, doesn't it?" The comment seemed innocent enough, but Jacob caught the meaningful look Ruth gave him over Miriam's bent head. Spring would indeed bring decisions about Sarah's schooling, about Miriam's continued recovery, about the sustainability of their current arrangement. It was Sarah herself who inadvertently forced the issue. During a particularly difficult day at school, one of her classmates had made cruel remarks about English charity cases. She came home in tears and threw herself into Jacob's arms with desperate intensity. "I don't want to be different anymore," she sobbed against his shoulder. "I don't want people to stare at us or whisper about why we don't belong." Jacob held her tight, feeling her small body shake with the force of emotions too complex for an 8-year-old to process. Over her head, he met Miriam's stricken gaze and saw his own pain reflected there. "You belong here," Jacob said firmly, his voice rough with emotion. "With us. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "But what if they make us leave? What if they decide we're too much trouble?" The question that had haunted Jacob for months, finally spoken aloud by the child who trusted him to protect her from exactly that outcome. He looked into Sarah's tear-stained face and made a decision that had been building in his heart for weeks. "No one is going to make you leave," he said with quiet certainty. "This is your home, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep clutching her nearly finished birdhouse, Jacob sat at his kitchen table with legal documents spread before him. He'd driven to town that afternoon and consulted with an English lawyer about adoption procedures, about what it would take to legally secure Sarah's future, regardless of community approval. The process was complex, requiring Miriam's consent, background checks, home studies, and court appearances. But it was possible, a legal path to the family they had already become in their hearts. When Miriam found him there an hour later, she took one look at the papers and understood immediately what he was contemplating. "Jacob, you can't," she whispered, sinking into the chair beside him. "The community will never forgive this. You could lose everything, your standing, your business, your place among your people." "I could lose Sarah," Jacob replied simply. "That's not acceptable." He looked up at this woman who had somehow become essential to his happiness, whose quiet strength and gentle spirit had awakened parts of his heart he'd thought permanently closed. "I could lose both of you," he added softly, "and that would be far worse than losing the approval of people who would ask me to abandon a child who trusts me." Miriam's eyes filled with tears, but she reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "Are you sure? Once you start this process, there's no going back. Even if you change your mind later, the community will remember that you chose us over them. Jacob thought about his father's tools in the workshop, about Sarah's careful attention to his lessons, about the way 3 separate lives had woven together into something that felt like destiny. "I've already made my choice," he said. "Now, I just need to make it legal." Outside, the January wind howled around the farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Yoders. Inside, 3 people who had found each other across the barriers of tradition and circumstance, prepared to fight for the right to remain together. The battle for their family was about to begin. The knock on the door came at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening in February, interrupting the quiet routine of homework and wood carving that had become sacred to their little family. Sarah looked up from her math worksheet with the instant alertness of a child who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. Jacob opened the door to find a stranger, a man in his early 30s wearing an expensive coat and the kind of confident smile that immediately put Jacob on guard. Behind him stood a woman in a business suit, her briefcase and official demeanor marking her as someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "Mr. Yoder, I'm Marcus Miller, Sarah's father. This is my attorney, Catherine Wells. I believe you know my daughter." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He heard Miriam's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway, saw Sarah's pencil slip from suddenly nerveless fingers. The man, standing on his porch, bore little resemblance to the girl he'd come to love. Where Sarah had gentle brown eyes and a thoughtful expression, Marcus Miller's features were sharp and calculating. "What do you want?" Jacob asked, his voice deliberately calm, despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "To see my daughter, of course," Marcus replied, his smile widening, "and to discuss her future. May we come in? It's rather cold out here." Jacob stepped aside reluctantly, every instinct screaming that this man's presence meant danger for Sarah. As Marcus entered the warm farmhouse, his eyes swept the room with obvious assessment, taking in the simple furnishings, the child's schoolwork. Spread on the table, the domestic peace he was about to shatter. Sarah had gone very still, watching her biological father with the wary expression of a small animal sensing a predator. She didn't run to him or show any sign of recognition. Marcus Miller was a stranger to her, despite their blood connection. "Hello, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice taking on an artificially warm tone. "You've grown so much since I saw you last." "I was 5, Sarah said quietly. "I don't remember you." The simple statement seemed to catch Marcus off guard. He'd apparently expected a more emotional reunion, perhaps tears of joy or excited questions about his long absence. Instead, he faced a child who regarded him with polite curiosity and nothing more. "Well, that's understandable," he recovered quickly. "But I'm here now, and I have wonderful news. I'm in a position to provide for you properly. A real home, good schools, all the opportunities a growing girl needs." Miriam stepped forward from the kitchen doorway, her face pale but determined. "Marcus, you haven't contacted us in 3 years. Why now?" Marcus turned to face his ex-girlfriend with the same calculating smile. "I've been getting my life together, Miriam. Building a successful business, establishing stability. I'm married. Now to a wonderful woman who's excited about having a stepdaughter." The attorney, who had remained silent throughout the reunion, opened her briefcase with crisp efficiency. "Mr. Miller has filed for full custody of his daughter. As the biological father, he has significant legal rights that have been neglected. For too long, Jacob felt the world shift beneath his feet. All his careful research into adoption procedures had focused on Miriam's consent and the court's approval. He'd never considered that Sarah's absent father might resurface to claim rights he'd abandoned years ago. "You can't just show up and expect to take her," Miriam said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "Sarah has a life here, friends. Stability." "Living in charity housing with strangers?" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharpening. That's hardly stability, Miriam. A child needs her real family, not this. He gestured dismissively around the room. Whatever this arrangement is supposed to be. Sarah had been listening to this exchange with growing distress. Now she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I don't want to go with you," she said clearly, her young voice carrying absolute conviction. "This is my home. These are my real family." Marcus's facade of paternal warmth slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "Sweetheart, you don't understand. You're too young to make these kinds of decisions. That's why adults have to make them for you." "I understand plenty," Sarah replied, with the dignity that never failed to surprise Jacob. "I understand that you left us when things got hard. I understand that you never called or wrote or asked how we were doing. And I understand that families are made by people who take care of each other, not by people who share DNA." The attorney leaned forward, her expression professionally sympathetic. "Your feelings are understandable, Sarah, but the law recognizes biological relationships. Your father has been working hard to create a proper home for you. Where?" Jacob spoke for the first time since the introductions, his voice deadly quiet. "Where exactly has Mr. Miller been working so hard?" Marcus straightened, clearly pleased to discuss his success. "I own 3 restaurants in San Diego now. Very successful, very profitable. My wife Rebecca and I have a beautiful house in La Jolla, excellent schools in the district. Sarah would have every advantage." "And what happens to her mother?" Jacob asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus exchanged a glance with his attorney before answering. "Miriam would be welcome to visit, of course, but Sarah needs stability, and frankly, Miriam's health issues make her an unreliable guardian. The courts will see that a successful businessman with a stable marriage is the better choice for a child's welfare." It was then that Jacob understood the true nature of Marcus Miller's sudden interest in his daughter. This wasn't about love or family reunification. This was about image and respectability. A successful restaurateur with a picture-perfect family would make better business sense than a successful restaurateur who had abandoned his child. "How long do we have?" Miriam asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The attorney consulted her papers. "The hearing is scheduled for March 15th. Until then, Mr. Miller is requesting regular visitation to re-establish the father-daughter relationship." "No," Sarah said immediately. "I don't want visits. I want to stay here." Marcus's mask of patience was wearing thin. "Sarah, you're being unreasonable." "I'm your father. You're a stranger," Sarah interrupted with devastating honesty. "Jacob is more of a father to me than you've ever been." The words seemed to strike Marcus like a physical blow. His face flushed with anger, and for a moment, Jacob saw the selfish, volatile man who had walked away from his responsibilities 8 years ago. "We'll see what the court has to say about that," Marcus said coldly, "and about the appropriateness of an unmarried man raising someone else's child." After they left, the farmhouse felt hollowed out, as if Marcus Miller's presence had somehow contaminated the peace they'd built there. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at her unfinished math homework, while tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Miriam paced the small kitchen like a caged animal, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. "He's right about one thing," she said finally. "The courts will favor a biological parent with financial resources over our situation." Jacob sat down beside Sarah and pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face against his shoulder while her small body shook with silent sobs. "We'll fight this," he said quietly, his words meant for both Sarah and Miriam. "There has to be a way." "With what?" Miriam asked bitterly. "We don't have money for expensive lawyers. We don't have a legal marriage or traditional family structure. We have love and good intentions, and that doesn't count for much in family court." But Jacob was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis, remembering conversations with his English lawyer about the complexities of custody law. Biological relationships carried weight, but they weren't absolute. Courts considered the child's best interests, established relationships, and the quality of care being provided. Marcus Miller abandoned you both, Jacob said slowly, working through the implications. He provided no support, made no contact, showed no interest in Sarah's welfare for years. That has to count for something. Miriam looked up from her pacing, hope flickering in her eyes. You think we have a chance? Jacob looked down at Sarah, who had stopped crying and was listening intently to their conversation. I think we have. Something Marcus Miller doesn't. The truth. Sarah knows who really cares about her, who's been there through the difficult times, who's invested in her happiness rather than their own image. Will that be enough? Sarah asked in a small voice. Jacob touched the ring beneath his shirt, thinking of his first family and the fierce protectiveness that love could inspire. It's going to have to be, he said, because losing you isn't an option I'm willing to accept. Outside, February wind rattled the windows of the farmhouse that had become home to 3 people whose hearts were now legally bound together in a fight for their survival as a family. The battle Marcus Miller had started would test everything they believed about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of belonging. But they would face it together, armed with nothing more powerful than the truth of what they meant to each other, and the desperate hope that sometimes love really could conquer everything that stood in its way. The legal papers arrived on a Monday morning in late February, delivered by a courier who waited while Jacob signed for documents that could destroy everything he'd come to cherish. The formal language was cold and clinical. Petition for custody modification, motion for temporary visitation, financial affidavit. But the intent was clear. Marcus Miller was using every legal tool at his disposal to reclaim a daughter he'd abandoned. Jacob spread the papers across his kitchen table, while Miriam read over his shoulder, both of them struggling to understand the labyrinthine procedures that would determine Sarah's future. The child herself was at school, temporarily shielded from the adult complexities that threatened to uproot her life once again. He's requesting weekly supervised visits starting immediately, Miriam said, her voice tight with anxiety. And he wants the court to order a psychological evaluation of Sarah to assess the impact of her. She paused, reading directly from the document. Unconventional living arrangement with unrelated adults. Jacob felt anger kindle in his chest. The implication was clear. Their loving, stable home was being characterized as potentially harmful to Sarah's development. Marcus Miller, who had contributed nothing to his daughter's welfare for 3 years, was positioning himself as her rescuer. We need better legal representation, Jacob said, reaching for the phone book. The English lawyer he'd consulted about. Adoption was competent, but inexperienced in complex custody battles. They needed someone who could match Marcus Miller's high-powered attorney. It was then that Hannah Yoder knocked on the door, her arms full of her usual offerings of food and comfort. But today she also carried news that would change everything. I've been talking to people in the community, Hannah said without preamble, settling at the kitchen table as if she belonged there. About your situation, about what Marcus Miller is trying to do. Jacob tensed, expecting another lecture about propriety and community standards. Instead, Hannah reached into her basket and pulled out a thick envelope. This is from the Byler family fund, she said, placing the envelope in front of Jacob. And from the Bylers, the Zooks, the Millers. She smiled at the irony of the name. And about 20 other families who believe that what you're doing is right. Jacob opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was more money than he'd expected. Enough to hire a serious attorney, enough to fight Marcus Miller on equal terms. Hannah, I can't accept this. You can, and you will, Hannah interrupted firmly. Sarah isn't just your responsibility anymore, Jacob. She's become part of this community, and we protect our own. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. But the bishop, the elders, they made it clear that we weren't welcome. They made it clear that they weren't comfortable with change, Hannah corrected. But there's a difference between official disapproval and community rejection. More people support you than you realize. That afternoon, Jacob drove to Lancaster to meet with David. Morrison, the attorney several community members had recommended for difficult family law cases. Morrison was a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s who listened to their story with the intense focus of someone who had seen every variation of human conflict. "This isn't going to be easy," Morrison said after reviewing Marcus Miller's legal e-filing. "Biological parent rights are strong in Pennsylvania, especially when the father can demonstrate financial stability and a conventional family structure." "What about abandonment?" Jacob asked. "He had no contact with Sarah for 3 years. "We'll argue that, but Miller's attorney is already countering with documentation showing he was establishing financial stability and preparing a proper home for his daughter. They're framing his absence as responsible preparation rather than abandonment." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Jacob with shrewd eyes. "The stronger argument may be Sarah's established relationship with you and her clear preference to remain in your custody. But that's where things get complicated." "How so?" "You're not married to her mother. You have no legal standing as a step-parent or guardian, and your relationship with Miriam exists in a kind of legal grey area. Miller's attorney will argue that Sarah has formed an inappropriate attachment to a man who has no legitimate role in her life." Jacob felt the walls closing in around him. Every aspect of their unconventional family structure, the very things that made their relationship genuine and loving, could be twisted into legal ammunition against them. "What if Miriam and I were married?" he asked quietly. Morrison's eyebrows rose. "That would certainly strengthen your position. A married couple presenting a united front with the biological mother supporting your custody claim would be much harder to challenge." That evening, Jacob found himself walking the familiar path to his workshop, needing the comfort of wood and tools while he processed the impossible choices before him. Marriage to Miriam had been in his thoughts for months, but as something that might happen naturally over time. Now it was being forced upon him as a legal strategy. Miriam found him there an hour later, sitting at his workbench with a piece of oak he'd been shaping into what might someday become a jewelry box. "Hannah told me about the attorney's advice," she said, settling onto the stool where she'd spent so many peaceful evenings. "About marriage." Jacob set down his carving knife and looked at this woman who had become so essential to his happiness. "I don't want you to think I'm using the custody battle as an excuse to push for something you're not ready for." Miriam was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the scarred workbench. "What if I told you I've been ready for months? What if I told you that I've been falling in love with you since the morning you found me collapsed in the barn and chose to help instead of looking the other way?" Jacob's breath caught in his throat. "Miriam, I know it's complicated," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I know the community will see it as a convenient arrangement rather than a love match. But I also know that I can't imagine my life without you in it, custody battle or no custody battle." Jacob reached across the space between them and took her hands in his. "I've been afraid to tell you how I feel because I didn't want you to think I was taking advantage of your vulnerable situation. And I've been afraid to tell you because I didn't want you to feel obligated to rescue us," Miriam admitted. "But maybe we've both been overthinking this. Maybe sometimes love really is as simple as two people deciding they belong together." The proposal that followed wasn't elaborate or romantic in the conventional sense. Jacob simply asked Miriam to marry him, not just for Sarah's sake or for legal strategy, but because he couldn't imagine facing the future without her beside him. And Miriam said yes, not because it was practical or necessary, but because she had found in this quiet, gentle man the partner she'd never dared to hope for. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the courthouse, with Hannah Yoder and Dr. Henderson as witnesses. Sarah wore her best dress and carried a bouquet of dried flowers from Miriam's garden, her face radiant with joy that her family was finally, legally, officially complete. But even as they celebrated their newfound status as husband and wife, the custody battle loomed ahead of them like a storm on the horizon. Marcus Miller had not been idle during their legal preparations. His attorney had filed additional motions, questioning the timing of the marriage, suggesting it was a calculated move to strengthen their custody position rather than a genuine commitment. The supervised visitations began the following week, taking place at the Lancaster County Social Services office under the watchful eye of a court-appointed monitor. Jacob drove Sarah to these encounters with growing dread, watching her withdraw into herself each time she returned from an hour with the man who claimed to be her father. "He keeps talking about all the things he wants to buy me in California," Sarah confided after her third visit. "A new bicycle, fancy clothes, my own computer, but he doesn't ask about school or my friends or what I like to do." Jacob felt his heart break for this child, who could see so clearly through Marcus Miller's surface attempts at connection. "What do you tell him?" "I tell him about the farm and about learning woodworking and about how Mama is teaching me to can vegetables for winter," Sarah said. "But he looks bored when I talk about those things. He keeps saying I'll understand better when I'm living in a real city with real opportunities." The psychological evaluation Marcus had requested took place over 2 days in March, conducted by Dr. Patricia Williams, a child psychologist with 30 years of experience in custody disputes. She interviewed Sarah extensively, observed her interactions with both sets of potential parents, and toured the farmhouse that had become the child's sanctuary. "She's remarkably well-adjusted for a child who's experienced significant upheaval in her young life," Dr. Williams told Jacob and Miriam after completing her assessment. "Her attachment to both of you is clearly genuine and healthy. She feels safe, valued, and understood in your care." "What about her relationship with her biological father?" Miriam asked. Dr. Williams chose her words carefully. "Sarah is polite and respectful with Mr. Miller, but there's no evidence of the natural bonding you'd expect between a parent and child. She sees him as a stranger who happens to share her DNA, not as a father figure." The evaluation was just one piece of evidence that would be presented at the custody hearing, but it felt like a crucial victory. Sarah's own voice, filtered through professional assessment, would carry weight with the judge in ways that emotional testimony might not. As March 15th approached, Jacob found himself caught between hope and terror. Their legal team had assembled a compelling case, documentation of Marcus Miller's abandonment, evidence of Sarah's thriving development in their care, testimony from teachers and community members about the stability of her current home. But Marcus Miller's resources were formidable. His attorney had painted a picture of a reformed man who had spent years building the financial foundation necessary to provide proper care for his daughter. Character witnesses from his business associates and his new wife would testify to his commitment to family values and his excitement about reuniting with Sarah. The night before the hearing, Jacob sat with Sarah in his workshop while she put the finishing touches on a wooden jewelry box that had become her most ambitious carving project. Her small hands moved the tools with increasing confidence, shaping curves and smoothing surfaces with patient precision. "Are you scared about tomorrow?" Sarah asked, without looking up from her work. Jacob considered lying, offering false reassurance that everything would work out perfectly. But this child had already faced too many adult deceptions in her short life. "Yes," he said honestly, "I'm scared because losing you would break my heart completely." Sarah set down her carving knife and looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 8 years. "Mine too," she said simply, "but I'm not going to let that happen." "Sarah, you have to understand that this decision isn't up to you. Maybe not legally," she interrupted with quiet determination. "But I know who my real family is, and I'm going to make sure the judge knows too." The conviction in her voice reminded Jacob of Miriam's fierce protectiveness, of the strength that had carried them through months of uncertainty and community pressure. This child had inherited her mother's courage, along with her stubborn refusal to accept defeat. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Jacob said, "I want you to know that having you in my life has been the greatest gift I never expected to receive. You've made me remember what it feels like to be a father, what it means to have someone to protect and guide and love unconditionally." Sarah moved from her stool to wrap her arms around Jacob's neck, holding him tight in the lamplit workshop where they'd shared so many quiet hours of learning and connection. "You've made me remember what it feels like to have a daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. "Not just someone who shares my blood, but someone who cares about my dreams and listens to my fears and teaches me important things with patient hands." As they cleaned up the workshop and prepared for bed, Jacob felt the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. His father's tools, his grandfather's workbench, the accumulated wisdom of men who had built their lives around family and faith and the honest work of their hands. All of it could disappear tomorrow if the judge decided that biology trumped love. But looking at Sarah's sleeping face when he checked on her before his own restless sleep, Jacob knew he would never regret the choices that had brought them to this point. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the outcome, and some loves were worth defending even when the odds seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would determine whether the family they had built through trial and tenderness could survive the challenge of a legal system that valued conventional structures over genuine bonds. Whatever the judge decided, Jacob would face it with the certainty that he had given Sarah everything he had to offer: his protection, his guidance, his heart, and his unwavering commitment to her happiness. The rest was in hands larger and more powerful than his own. The Lancaster County courthouse buzzed with morning activity as Jacob, Miriam, and Sarah made their way through the marble corridors toward courtroom C. Sarah walked between her parents, her small hand gripping Jacob's with fierce determination, while her other hand clutched a folded piece of paper she'd worked on late into the night. Judge Margaret Chen presided over family court with a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for legal maneuvering that put children's welfare second to adult convenience. At 62, she had seen every variation of custody dispute, from the genuinely heartbreaking to the calculatedly cruel. Marcus Miller sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Catherine Wells, both dressed in expensive suits that spoke of success and respectability. His new wife, Rebecca, had accompanied him, a perfectly coiffed woman in her 30s who kept glancing at Sarah with the uncomfortable expression of someone trying to bond with an acquisition rather than a child. "Your Honor," Attorney Wells began, "this case centers on a fundamental question: whether a child's biological father, who has worked tirelessly to establish financial stability and a proper family environment, should be denied his parental rights in favor of strangers who have overstepped appropriate boundaries." She painted Marcus Miller as a reformed young man who had recognized his past mistakes and spent years preparing to provide his daughter with every advantage. His restaurant business generated substantial income. His marriage offered Sarah a stable two-parent household, and his San Diego home provided access to superior educational and cultural opportunities. Mr. Miller deeply regrets the circumstances that led to his separation from his daughter, Wells continued, but he has demonstrated through his actions that he is committed to being the father Sarah deserves. Jacob listened to this version of events with mounting anger. The circumstances Wells referenced so delicately were Marcus's decision to abandon his pregnant girlfriend when medical bills became inconvenient. The separation had been Marcus's choice, maintained through 3 years of absolute silence. When David Morrison rose to present their case, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for children's rights. Your Honor, this case is indeed about what Sarah Miller deserves. She deserves to remain with the people who have loved her, protected her, and provided for her needs when her biological father chose not to. She deserves to stay in the home where she has thrived, with the parents who have proven their commitment through actions rather than legal documents. Morrison methodically dismantled Marcus Miller's claims of reformed responsibility. Phone records showed no attempts to contact Sarah or Miriam in 3 years. Financial records revealed no child support payments, no contributions to medical expenses, no acknowledgement of paternal obligations. School records documented Sarah's dramatic improvement in both academic performance and social adjustment since living with Jacob and Miriam. Mr. Miller's sudden interest in custody coincides suspiciously with his business expansion, and marriage to a woman who believes having a stepdaughter will complete her perfect family picture, Morrison observed. This is not about love or commitment. This is about image and convenience. The psychological evaluation proved devastating to Marcus Miller's case. Dr. Williams testified that Sarah showed clear signs of anxiety when discussing the possibility of moving to California, while demonstrating remarkable emotional security when talking about her life on Jacob's farm. In 30 years of evaluating children in custody disputes, Dr. Williams stated, I have rarely seen such a clear preference for one living situation over another. Sarah has found genuine stability and love with Mr. and Mrs. Yoder. Removing her from that environment would constitute psychological trauma. But it was Sarah herself who delivered the most powerful testimony. Judge Chen had initially planned to interview the child in chambers, but Sarah had specifically requested to address the court directly. Morrison had been hesitant, knowing that 8-year-olds could be unpredictable witnesses, but Sarah's quiet determination had convinced him to make the request. Your Honor, Sarah said, standing at the witness stand with a composure that belied her young age. I wrote something down because I was afraid I might forget the important parts if I just tried to talk. Judge Chen nodded encouragingly. Go ahead, Sarah. Take your time. Sarah unfolded her carefully written letter and began to read in a clear, steady voice. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Miller, and I'm 8 years old. I want to tell you about families, because I think maybe some grown-ups don't understand how they really work. My birth father left when I was 5 because he said taking care of me was too hard and cost too much money. For 3 years, he never called to ask if I was okay, or if I needed anything, or if I missed him. I used to wonder if maybe he was sick or lost, but my mama explained that sometimes people just decide they don't want to be fathers anymore. Jacob, Yoder never decided to be my father. It just happened because he has a heart that cares about people who need help. When my mama got sick, he could have found us somewhere else to live, but instead, he made room for us in his house and in his life. He teaches me important things like how to take care of animals and how to carve wood and how to be brave when things are scary. He doesn't have a lot of money, but he uses what he has to make sure Mama can get her medicine and I can go to school and we can eat good food every day. He doesn't buy me expensive presents, but he made me this wooden goat with his own hands because he knows I love the animals on our farm. Sarah paused, pulling the carved goat from her pocket and holding it up for the judge to see. A real father is someone who shows up every day, even when it's hard. Someone who listens when you're sad and celebrates when you're happy and teaches you how to be a good person. Someone who loves you not because they have to, but because they choose to. She folded her letter carefully and looked directly at Judge Chen. Marcus Miller might be my biological father, but Jacob Yoder is my daddy. And I'm asking you please not to take me away from the family that actually wants me. The courtroom fell, silent as Sarah finished her testimony and carefully folded her letter. Judge Chen's expression remained professionally neutral, but Jacob caught a fleeting softness in her eyes that gave him the first real hope he'd felt since Marcus Miller appeared on his doorstep. Attorney Wells rose for cross-examination, her approach carefully calculated to appear gentle while undermining Sarah's testimony. Sarah, you've been through a lot of changes in your young life, haven't you? New homes, your mother's illness, uncertainty about the future. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied politely. And Mr. Yoder has been very kind to you during this difficult time. It's natural that you would feel grateful to him. I don't feel grateful, Sarah said, her young voice carrying surprising clarity. I feel loved. Wells paused, clearly not expecting such a direct response. But sweetie, don't you think you might feel differently about your biological father if you had a chance to really get to know him? If you could see the beautiful home he's prepared for you? Sarah considered the question seriously, as if she were weighing a complex mathematical problem. Ma'am, my birth father had 8 years to get to know me if he wanted to. He chose not to. Now he wants to take me away from people who did choose to know me and love me. That doesn't seem fair. Marcus Miller had grown increasingly agitated during Sarah's testimony, and now he leaned forward to whisper urgently in his attorney's ear. Wells nodded and turned back to Sarah. Your father has explained that he needed time to establish himself financially before he could provide properly for you. Doesn't that show responsibility? It might, Sarah agreed thoughtfully, if he had ever asked what I needed or how Mama and I were doing while he was getting established. But he never did. So I think he was just doing what was good for him, not what was good for me. The simple logic was devastating. Wells tried several more approaches, but Sarah's responses remained consistent and thoughtful, never wavering from her central truth. Jacob and Miriam had chosen to love and care for her, while Marcus Miller had chosen to abandon her. When Marcus himself took the stand, his testimony followed the script his attorney had prepared: remorse for past mistakes, evidence of current stability, promises of future opportunities. But under Morrison's cross-examination, the facade began to crumble. Mr. Miller, you testified that you left because you weren't ready for the financial responsibility of fatherhood. When exactly did you determine that you were ready? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Over the past year, as my business became more successful, was it before or after you married Mrs. Miller, your current wife, not Sarah's mother? After, but... And was it before or after Mrs. Miller, again, your current wife, expressed her desire for children? Marcus's attorney objected, but Judge Chen allowed the question. Marcus's answer was telling. Rebecca has always wanted to be a mother. When I told her about Sarah, she was excited about the possibility of having an instant family. Morrison pressed on relentlessly. So to be clear, your decision to seek custody of Sarah coincided with your new wife's maternal desires and your business success, but had nothing to do with any contact with or concern for your daughter's well-being over the past 3 years. I've always cared about Sarah, yet you made no effort to contact her, provide for her, or inquire about her health and development during that time. I was building a foundation. Mr. Miller, yes or no, did you make any attempt to contact your daughter or contribute to her support between January 2022 and February 2025? Marcus's silence was answer enough. The final witness was Jacob himself. Morrison kept his testimony focused on facts, the circumstances of their first meeting, Sarah's adaptation to farm life, her academic and emotional progress, the family. Routine they had established, but it was during cross-examination that Jacob's true feelings emerged. Wells attempted to portray him as a lonely widower who had inappropriately attached himself to another man's child, but Jacob's responses carried a quiet dignity that couldn't be shaken. "Mr. Yoder, isn't it true that you were grieving the loss of your own family when you took in Mrs. Miller and her daughter?" "Yes, I was grieving," Jacob admitted. "I had been for 7 years. And didn't Sarah fill an emotional void in your life?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Sarah didn't fill a void. She helped me remember what it meant to be alive instead of just surviving. But surely you understand that your emotional needs can't override a biological father's rights." Jacob looked directly at Marcus Miller before answering. "I understand that a child's needs should override everyone else's rights, including mine. If I genuinely believed that Sarah would be better off with Mr. Miller, I would support that decision, no matter how much it hurt me." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "But I've watched Sarah with her biological father. I've seen how she withdraws when he talks about changing everything in her life. I've seen the fear in her eyes when she thinks about leaving the only stable home she's ever known. A real father puts his child's well-being above his own desires. That's what I'm trying to do here." Judge Chen called a brief recess to review the evidence and testimony. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah slipped her hand into Jacob's and squeezed tight. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "you'll always be my real daddy." Jacob felt tears prick his eyes as he squeezed back. In 15 minutes, Judge Chen would return with a decision that would either preserve their family or tear it apart forever. But in that moment, holding his daughter's hand and seeing the love and trust in her eyes, Jacob knew that some bonds could never be broken by legal documents or judicial rulings. The truth of their connection existed beyond the power of any court to dissolve. Judge Chen returned to the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who understood the weight of the decision she was about to deliver. Sarah sat between Jacob and Miriam, her small hand clasping the wooden goat that had become her talisman through the long months of uncertainty. "In custody, matters involving minor children," Judge Chen began, her voice carrying the authority. "Of 3 decades on the bench, the court's primary consideration must always be the best interests of the child. While biological relationships carry significant legal weight, they do not automatically supersede the child's emotional, psychological, and developmental needs." Marcus Miller leaned forward in his chair, his expression confident despite the damaging testimony he'd endured. His attorney had assured him that biological fathers rarely lost custody battles when they could demonstrate financial stability and a conventional family structure. "I have carefully reviewed all testimony and evidence presented in this matter," Judge Chen continued. "The psychological evaluation by Dr. Williams, the character testimony from teachers and community members, the documentation of Mr. Miller's absence from his daughter's life, and most importantly, the clear and compelling testimony from Sarah herself." The judge paused, looking directly at Sarah with an expression that was both gentle and serious. "Sarah, I want you to know that I listened very carefully to everything you said today. Your letter showed remarkable maturity and insight about what makes a real family. The court has decided that your best interests lie in remaining with the people who have consistently demonstrated their love and commitment to your well-being." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Sarah's face lit up with joy so pure and radiant that Jacob felt his heart might burst from his chest. Miriam's quiet sob of relief echoed through the suddenly electrified space. "Therefore," Judge Chen continued, her voice growing stronger, The court denies Mr. Marcus Miller's petition for custody. Furthermore, given Mr. Miller's documented abandonment of his parental responsibilities and his daughter's clearly stated preferences, the court is prepared to consider termination of his parental rights should Mr. and Mrs. Yoder choose to pursue formal adoption proceedings. Marcus Miller shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. She's my daughter, my blood." "Mr. Miller," Judge Chen interrupted with icy authority, "you forfeited your claim to parenthood when you chose to abandon your daughter for 3 years. Blood alone does not make a father. Mr. Yoder has been more of a father to Sarah in 8 months than you were in her first 5 years of life." The gavel came down with finality that echoed through Jacob's soul like church bells announcing salvation. Sarah threw herself into his arms with such force that he nearly lost his balance, her small body shaking with tears of pure joy. "We can stay together," she whispered against his neck. "We're really a family now." "We always were," Jacob whispered. Back, his own voice thick with emotion. "The law just finally caught up with our hearts." 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that mirrored the day when their story began, Jacob stood in the same courthouse where their custody battle had been fought. But this time, he was there for a different kind of legal proceeding, one that would complete the transformation that had begun the morning he watched a little girl take over her mother's chores without complaint. Sarah Elizabeth Yoder, her name legally changed to reflect the reality of their relationship, stood beside him in a new dress that Miriam had sewn with meticulous care. The adoption papers were signed, witnessed, and officially recorded, making permanent what their hearts had known for more than a year. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, attended by the community members who had supported them through their darkest hours. Hannah Yoder dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, while Dr. Henderson beamed with grandfatherly pride. Even Bishop Stoltzfus had come, his presence a quiet acknowledgement that love sometimes transcended the boundaries of tradition. As they walked out of the courthouse into the autumn sunshine, Sarah slipped her hand into Jacob's with the casual confidence of a child who no longer had to worry about being separated from the people she loved. "Papa," she said. She had started calling him Papa after the custody hearing, saying it felt more special than the English "Dad. Will you teach me how to make a cradle?" Jacob looked at Miriam, whose gentle smile and knowing look confirmed what he had begun to suspect over the past few weeks. New life was stirring in their carefully reconstructed family, bringing with it the promise of futures they had barely dared to imagine. "A cradle for whom?" he asked gently, though he already knew the answer. "For my baby brother or sister," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Mama told me this morning. I want to help make something beautiful for them to sleep in, something they can keep forever." That evening, as the 3 of them, soon to be 4, sat around the kitchen table planning the new baby's nursery, Jacob felt a sense of completion that went deeper than happiness. The empty rooms of his farmhouse would soon echo with new voices, new laughter, new stories of growth and discovery. Sarah had finished her wooden jewelry box the week before, its surfaces smooth and its joints fitted with the precision that came from patient teaching and dedicated practice. The box sat on her dresser now, holding the treasures that marked her journey from lost child to beloved daughter. Her first school picture from the Amish school, a pressed flower from Miriam's wedding bouquet, and the tiny wooden goat that Jacob had carved during those first tentative days of connection. As winter approached and the cycle of seasons continued its eternal rhythm, Jacob reflected on the mystery of how broken hearts could heal and empty lives could fill with unexpected blessing. Sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as burdens, and sometimes the families that mattered most were built not from blood, but from the daily choice to love and care for one another. The little girl who had covered her mother's shift on an Amish farm had taught them all that courage came in the smallest packages, and that love, real, lasting, transformative love, was always worth fighting for, no matter what obstacles stood in its way. In his workshop that evening, as Sarah practiced her carving techniques and Miriam hummed lullabies while mending tiny clothes, Jacob touched the ring that still hung beneath his shirt and whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances and the grace that made them possible. Outside, the November wind carried the promise of snow. But inside their farmhouse, spring had come to stay.